Lewis and Clark were gone for 2.5 years, and their legacy continues till today. So it's a lot to cover, and I have to cram it all in an hour. So I'm going to go ahead and get started and hopefully move through it quickly enough that we'll have some time for questions at the end. I have traveled the Lewis and Clark Trail, and I'd like to be able to tell you that I traveled it on keelboat, dugout canoe, horses, buffalo raft, and stayed in a fort. But the reality is, I traveled by Jeep. But I did have the top down, so I kind of was roughing it. But the most important thing is I did get to enjoy the fabulous scenery of the American West. And that's really what turned me on to the Lewis and Clark expedition. Quick story. I did not know much about Lewis and Clark 20 years ago, but I was traveling with students. We went to New Orleans, and that happened to be 2003 when America was celebrating the Louisiana Purchase, the bicentennial of that. So we saw an IMAX show about the Lewis and Clark expedition, and I was hooked. It's still I saw it on an IMAX screen, which is probably rare to be able to see that today. But it's narrated by Jeff Bridges, the famous actor, and you see lots of the spectacular scenery, and you get a sense of the incredible adventure. And that's what turned me on to Lewis and Clark. So I began teaching and writing about it. I've made the trip twice. And I've taken a lot of the pictures you're going to see here. I'm going to try to capture what I think is really extraordinary about the journey. And again, I have to move pretty quickly here. So we're going to go ahead and get started and talk about how the whole thing got started and then what happened over the course of those 2 years and 4 months. So you might say that the history of it goes all the way back to the 1600s when John Smith, who was one of the settlers of the original first permanent English settlement, Jamestown, in 1607, even he, way back then, was looking for a Northwest Passage, a way that we could cross the entire continent. Because, of course, back then, before airplanes and cars and even before trains, the easiest way to travel across the country and to move goods was by water. So it would be very important and valuable if someone could find a Northwest Passage, but no one ever did. Well, then comes the date of 1803. As I mentioned, that's when the United States doubled its size by making the Louisiana Purchase. So Jefferson had sent ministers to France, and he was interested in buying New Orleans, but he actually had the opportunity when Napoleon said he would sell the entire Louisiana territory, 820,000 square miles, for only $15 million. And that was the opportunity he had to double the size of the country. Well, at that point, he wanted to know what was out there. And back then, there was very little really known about that area. There were some fur trappers, there were some French Canadians who were out that way, but we didn't really know. And of course, there were lots of Native Americans, but not enough communication going on that people knew what was actually out there. So when Jefferson decided he wanted to know, he wanted to send someone out there on an expedition. The most important thing was to find that Northwest Passage, if there was one. Speculation, but no evidence that there might actually be a Northwest Passage. That was the most important thing. But he also wanted someone to document the American West. He wanted someone to draw maps, to collect detailed information, and I mean detailed information about the soils, minerals, crops, animals, weather, to meet the Indians, to learn about their languages, populations, religions, customs, food, clothing, and of course, their willingness to trade with the Americans. Jefferson, as many of you know, was a scientist and inventor in his own right, but he also at this point was president and was very interested in the opportunities for commerce, especially in the early 1800s when there was an incredible commercial opportunity in the fur trade. Furs were kind of like oil today. It was an incredible opportunity to make a lot of money, and the United States now had access to unimaginable amounts of fur that they would have access to. But they would have to be able to negotiate it with the Native Americans. Obviously, they didn't want to start wars with the Native Americans, and Jefferson wanted to know as much as possible about this area. But the question was, whom would he send out there? Well, he decided he really wanted somebody, ideally, who had a complete scientific knowledge of botany, natural history, mineralogy, and astronomy, but also had the firmness of constitution and character, prudence, habits adapted to the woods, and familiarity with the Indian manners and character. Well, that would be a little like trying to find somebody who was a decathlete who could also write scientific treatises in iambic pentameter. Nobody existed, and Jefferson knew it. What he did realize is that he knew somebody. It happened to be his personal secretary, a guy named Meriwether Lewis, who had the latter. In other words, he could survive in the woods and he could deal with Native Americans, even if he didn't have all of that knowledge. Jefferson realized he could give this guy a crash course in all of that knowledge, and that's exactly what he did. Well, Lewis actually knew another man who was a little bit older than he was, and had was his commanding officer in the U.S. Army, and that man's name, of course, was William Clark. Clark had been born in Virginia, but he was living in Indiana at this time, which is a special thrill for me as a Hoosier. Some of you may be familiar with the name George Rogers Clark, who is not as well known as William Clark, but back in his own day was better known because he was a hero of the American Revolution. And George Rogers Clark was living in Indiana. Last I was down that way, you can actually see the cabin that he was living in. Clark had left the army at this. William Clark had left the army at this point, but had been a soldier in the army, had served with Meriwether Lewis, and resigned from the army to look after his father's estate. So now they're ready to go. Now, as I said, Lewis has to study a lot of this material because Jefferson wants somebody who can act like a scientist, even if he wasn't trained as a scientist. So Lewis spends weeks studying in Philadelphia, which was the major metropolis of the era. He's studying medicine with Dr. Rush, astronomy with Andrew Ellicott, zoology with Caspar Wister, and botany with Benjamin Smith Barton. And if you're a historian, you may recognize some of those names, even if you're a history buff. Benjamin Rush was a very famous doctor, and Benjamin Smith Barton is also very well known. So Lewis was studying with the leading minds of his time. He also had to prepare for the expedition by purchasing a lot of supplies. And you can imagine what was required back then. They didn't have the science we do today, but they did have telescopes, chronometers, quadrants, compasses, saws, hatchets, chisels. So he needs the scientific instrumentation, but he also needs the items that they'll need simply to survive in the wilderness. He's bringing along a lot of food, but the plan also is they're bringing rifles along, of course, so they can kill food along the way because they couldn't possibly carry as much food as they would need over the course of time it would take. And it should be remarked that they did not know how long it would take, and you'll understand why in a minute. They're also bringing along 288 thimbles, 4,600 sewing needles. And if you didn't think that Lewis was a seamstress, you're right, he was not. These are all trade items that they're going to need when they're meeting up with the Native Americans along the way. So they're also bringing handkerchiefs and kettles and mirrors and 130 rolls of tobacco, 33 pounds of beads. And I've got some pictures of replicas here just to give you a sense of some of the things that they were bringing along. Obviously, they brought a lot more beads than that, but that gives you an idea. These are all pictures that I took along the way in various museums you can see along the way. So he is packing for a long journey, packing things that they will need to survive and also things they will need for trading purposes. Now, I will admit, I don't know about the rest of you, but I did not know a lot about Lewis and Clark until I became interested. I knew of Lewis and I knew of Clark, and of course, I heard of Sacagawea, but when you see the images, sometimes you'll see a picture of the two of them, and sometimes you'll see the picture of Sacagawea pointing. The reality is it was not just the three of them. There were dozens of people who came along with them, especially going up the Missouri River, as we'll see in a moment. But they had to assemble that crew. And this was much harder than you might realize because back then, the soldiers who were available, or young men who were available to be soldiers, were a pretty rough and tumble bunch. Soldiers did not have the respect that they have and deserve today. Back then, they were not considered to be especially reputable people. And in many cases, they were not reputable people. And Lewis and Clark, when they were trying to assemble a crew, might have to deal with Army captains or sergeants who were trying to get rid of the folks they didn't want serving in their contingent. So Lewis and Clark had to worry about getting some of the less reputable characters. As it turns out, they actually did very well. They did have to issue 7 court-martials on the way up. We don't have time to get into the details of that. 7 actually is not that many for that time period. They would have had a lot more probably if they had been serving in, for example, Fort Wayne, where Anthony Wayne had ruled with an iron fist. After they left Fort Mandan, they didn't issue a single court-martial, and actually at that point the men were behaving pretty well. They wanted stout, healthy, unmarried men. I can only guess why they wanted them to be unmarried. Maybe because they could concentrate more on what they were doing out there and didn't have attachments back home. But of course, they wanted men who were accustomed to the woods and capable of bearing bodily fatigue. Altogether, there are about 30 men. It depends on how you count. There were more who went up the Missouri, but some of them went back before the rest of the crew went across the country. They had three sergeants initially, but one of them, a spoiler alert, Charles Floyd dies a few months in, and they replace him with one of the other. They replace him, I think it was Patrick Gass. It was Ordway, Pryor, and Floyd. I may have that wrong. There were four sergeants altogether, but one of them died. Floyd is the one who died. They had some privates, some of whom were a half Indian. They had an interpreter, which would only go so far because there are lots of languages out there and no interpreter could know all of the languages. But in some cases, they were able to work through a fur trapper who happened to know, let's say, Hidatsa, and they might have to use a lot of sign language as well. And then York brought along his slave, which is an interesting person to include because York is really essentially equals with the rest while he's traveling with the rest of them. And at one point, he gets to vote on something, which was the first time that a slave would have been able to vote on something official in the history of the United States. So let's take them through their journey. We're going to take it in stages here. They head up the Missouri River. And the reason for that is that that was the best way to travel back then, to travel by water. But if you know anything about geography, you know that the Missouri River was traveling against them. It was traveling east and then south, and then it merges with the Mississippi River because all of this water is emptying into the Gulf of Mexico. So they are traveling against the current, and the current of the Missouri River was about 5 to 6 miles an hour. It was a beast. They were getting rammed with debris in the water. They had to worry about sand falls falling off or the shore collapsing onto the boat. It was one of the more impressive parts of the journey, but it starts out mildly enough. I love the way that Clark starts his journal. And I should mention right now that Lewis and Clark kept voluminous journals. I have read a lot of them, but life's too short. I have not read all 12 volumes or whatever there are of them. I've read one very long version of it. William Clark, Meriwether Lewis kept voluminous journals, but also John Ordway and some of the other members of the expedition. So we have an enormous amount of information about the expedition. This is how Clark begins his journal entry on May 14th, which of course is just a couple of days ago, and we get a sense of what it looked like at the beginning. And these are all, again, pictures that I've taken here. So this is a picture of the Missouri River, or it might have been the Mississippi because they traveled briefly on the Mississippi before they came into the Missouri. He wrote, I set out at 4 o'clock p.m. in the presence of many of the neighboring inhabitants and proceeded on under a gentle breeze up the Missouri. Sounds mild enough, sounds easy enough. You hop in a boat and you start traveling along the Missouri River, but it was going to be much more arduous than this. By the way, I'm an English professor. I do know how to spell the word gentle, but William Clark did not. William Clark is one of my heroes, but he probably wouldn't have passed my English class. How are they traveling? Well, obviously, they're traveling by water. They're traveling primarily by a 55-foot long keel boat. The keel boat no longer exists, although there are replicas made of it. This is a replica that I saw in St. Louis, so it gives you a sense of what that keel boat would have looked like. Imagine how heavy that would have been floating against the current. Now, you see a sail there. They could use a sail if all the stars aligned, so to speak, and they had the wind going the right direction and they could travel by sail. But much of the time they could not use the sail. And in fact, one time a tree knocked over the mast and broke the mast. So they were continually dealing with those kinds of challenges. Well, it held a lot of their supplies, and that's why they brought along a keel boat. It was not going to be easy to move this against the current of the Missouri River, but they needed to carry all those supplies, at least up the first leg of the journey. So they are, and they also have two pirogues. You can see a picture in the bottom right there. So these are smaller boats. So three boats altogether for all of these. At this point, I think there are 36 men. This is before Sacagawea joins them. And they are rowing. They are tugging. In other words, they are attaching the keel boat to a rope, and then men on the shore, when they can get past all the brush, are pulling this gigantic keel boat against the current. Sometimes using a giant pole and driving into the ground and moving forward that way. They're averaging about 10 to 15 miles a day. That's impressive when you think about the challenges, but do the math. They have to travel, the first leg is 1,600 miles. So it had to get pretty old to be doing all of that work. And by the way, I've seen one estimate that they may have been burning somewhere in the neighborhood of 7,000 to 8,000 calories a day. This is incredibly difficult labor that they're doing to be able to move against the current of the mighty Missouri. Along the way, you can only imagine what they're enduring: boils, dysentery, snake bite, heat stroke. And I mentioned that Charles Floyd dies along the way. Oddly enough, he dies of something that has nothing to do with the journey. He dies probably of appendicitis, which they could not have been able to cure or treat, even if he had been in the heart of Philadelphia. So every other man and woman on the journey survives the entire journey against the odds of many of these different things they're facing, including the snake bite, the sickness, and many other things you'll see along the way. So Floyd is the only casualty of the entire expedition. They reach Fort Mandan, and you can see all of this. As I said, I've traveled this trail a couple of times. You can see all these things along the way. Almost everything you see is going to be a replica, other than the Missouri River and the Rocky Mountains, obviously. But anything that's built, almost all of it, with one exception, is a replica. So this is a replica of the fort that they stayed at over the winter. They were hardy, but they were not foolhardy. Say they didn't try to travel through the plains in the wintertime. They knew they would have to stop for the winter. So they start camping, and they build this fort from scratch. This is what it looks like. They begin building in November, so already it would have been cold in North Dakota at this point. And by the way, if you ever want to see it, this is Washburn, North Dakota. It's about 45 minutes north of Bismarck, North Dakota. Um, it's cold there. At one point, the temperature drops below 40 degrees Fahrenheit, negative 40 degrees Fahrenheit. And they didn't know what wind chill was. So this is actual, no telling what the wind chill was in that place. And I can practically read Alan's mind. Alan's from Minnesota, and he's thinking, yeah, been there. I've lived through that. They commenced a map of the country. Remember that Jefferson wants them to map as much of this country as possible. And as it so happens, William Clark is a master cartographer. If we have time, we'll talk more about that later. So he is drawing maps of everything he's seeing along the way. On April 7th, over the course of this winter they spent there, they have now they're ready to send a keelboat back with whatever specimens they've collected so far. And some of the men are going to travel back in the keelboat, and the rest of them are going to make the rest of the journey across the American West. If you do happen to go, and I do recommend it if you're interested in Lewis and Clark, if you do happen to go to Fort Mandan, the replica that is there and operated by the National Park Service, you can see replicas of the kind of materials they would have had, the beds that they and the men would have slept in. So it's kind of fun to see and kind of get a sense of what they would have lived with when they were there. And they also have a giant book showing the replicas of the maps that Clark was creating along the way. Well, they're staying there with tribe of Indians, the Hidatsas and the Mandans, and that's why it's called Fort Mandan. The picture you see in the upper right is a diorama, and so I took several pictures from a diorama that you can see. I think I came across this in St. Charles, Missouri. It's very handy when you're giving a presentation because they didn't have photography. They didn't even do any serious sketching. The images you see are paintings that were done years later, but it gives you some idea of the tribes they would have met along the way. Again, Lewis is keeping a very detailed journal, and at times it can be a little bit comical. Lewis doesn't seem to have a great sense of humor based on what I've read, but sometimes he is funny, maybe when he doesn't mean to be. So this is what he wrote while they were staying there at Fort Mandan over the winter of 1804 and 1805. Visited by many of the natives, among others the Big White, the Coal, Big Man, Hairy Horn, and the Black Man. I smoked with them, after which they retired, a deportment not common, for they usually pester us with their good company the balance of the day after one being introduced to our apartment. So apparently these were not only friendly Indians, they were a little bit too friendly for Lewis's taste, but he tended to be sort of a solitary guy. Clark was really the more outgoing of the two. Well, the most important person they meet there is a teenage girl, and she really is literally a girl at this point, probably about 16, 17 years old. Nobody knows for certain. And her name, of course, is Sacagawea. For some reason, people came to know her as Sacagawea, but I'm so used to saying Sacagawea. Sacagawea is what most people call her, but she's known as but we have reason to think it was really pronounced Sacagawea. And she is going to be an extremely important figure, maybe not for the reasons you might think. Too often she is depicted as a guide who led them along the way. She really didn't know enough about the West to be able to lead them, except in one or two cases. But she was extremely important for other reasons. And in all seriousness, she's the most admirable person of the entire journey, for reasons you'll see in just a moment. She is one of the wives of a man named Charbonneau, who's not nearly as well known for good reason because he was kind of a clown, as you'll see in a few minutes. But he comes along as well. He is her husband. He does have one advantage is that he speaks French and he can speak French, and that can be part of the translation that takes place along the expedition. They're also going to get another traveler to come along with them because in February 1805, about 3 months or 2 months before they are going to leave out to the west, Sacagawea gives birth to a baby boy. Well, back then, of course, it made no sense for her to leave the boy behind. So this baby is going to make the entire journey across the West carried by Sacagawea. And that is why I say that Sacagawea is the greatest hero of a journey filled with heroes, because she was traveling not only for herself, but also was literally carrying this baby on her back and in her arms for the entire journey across the West. It's a testimony to motherhood. This is a statue of her. I love this statue. I use this picture very often. This is a statue you can see of her and Jean-Baptiste. That's the name of her son, her baby son. You can see this out at Fort Clatsop, and we'll talk more about that in a few minutes. That's the other fort they built for their second winter out in the American West. So they have traveled up the Missouri, poling that keelboat. Now they send the keelboat back, and now they're going to travel by canoe and pirogues. They bring along the pirogues. They're smaller boats than the keelboat was. And now they're going to travel across the Great Plains. And if you do make this drive, or those of you may actually know the area out here, this is some of the most spectacular scenery you will see in the entire United States. It is magnificent. Well, they were hopeful at the beginning. They have gone through a lot of adversity simply trying to move that keelboat and the two pirogues up the mighty Missouri. But now they are traveling without the keelboat, but still against the current, and now is when the adventure really begins. Lewis knows that this is going to be an extremely difficult journey because he knows they're traveling at least 2,000 miles, but really they don't know how far they're going and they don't know what they're going into. And as he says here, they were traveling in these small vessels. Keelboat's gone now. They're traveling in small vessels, dugout canoes and pirogues with every article that they were going to need to defend themselves. But despite all of that, he says that the men are living in unison. They're happy. They're zealously attached to the enterprise. They leave on April 7th, 1805. We think things are cold here in Indiana, but it's much worse in that part of the country. So they're pretty daring if they're leaving in April. April is not springtime in this part of the country, but they have to keep moving. And this is what they're traveling into. Of all the images that I've taken myself and seen, this is probably one of my top 5 favorites because it really gives you a sense of what they knew about what they were going into. And what did they know? Virtually nothing. They were traveling almost literally into a giant blank. This was one of the best maps they had to go on. And as you can see, there are some markings on the Pacific coast. There are some markings in the east. And in between, almost all they know, is that there are some mountains out there and they can travel along the Missouri. For all they know, the Missouri will travel all the way across the continent, or probably more likely that there will be a short portage that they can walk across, carry their canoes, carry their supplies, and then get into the Columbia because they knew about the Columbia River. People had explored the Pacific coast, but nobody other than the natives who lived out there had done any really extensive exploring of the West they were going into. So they were traveling into a giant blank. It was going to be up to Clark to map this area, but it was up to all of them to survive it. Well, along the way, Charbonneau shows his worth, which is not much. He is traveling on this boat, one of the pirogues, and a squall hits. And he is the one who needs to be able to save them all, but he is not a waterman. And as Lewis says, it happened, unfortunately, for this evening that Charbonneau was at the helm of this pirogue. Charbonneau cannot swim and is perhaps the most timid waterman in the world. Charbonneau, still crying to his God for mercy, had not yet recollected the rudder and do his duty, nor could the repeated orders of the bowsman, Cruzat, bring him to his recollection until he threatened to shoot him instantly if he did not take hold of the rudder and do his duty. While Charbonneau is the goat, the hero is by no question Sacagawea. She manages to have the wherewithal and the composure, and as Lewis puts it, the fortitude and resolution to actually start gathering up the materials that they were losing while Charbonneau is crying to his God for mercy. Sacagawea is collecting the things that otherwise would have gone down the river and would have been lost forever. And as Lewis wrote, these were the most important things they needed to be able to survive, not to mention some of the articles, specimens, journals, things that they were collecting. Virtually everything they needed was in this pirogue, and Sacagawea was fishing it out and saving it, all while, you guessed it, holding her baby in her arm. Too many adventures for me to cover all of them. But one of my favorites is what happens after they have started out. They're traveling the Missouri, and they know the Missouri is going to take them deep into the West. And of course, along the way, many of you know you've seen rivers, you've been on rivers, maybe you boated on rivers. Rivers have tributaries, and usually that's not a problem. You keep traveling the main river and you skip the tributaries. Well, at some point, they came to a tributary that was so large that they didn't know which one was the Missouri that would carry them in the right direction and which one would carry them in the wrong direction. It's a very important point. At this point, you're approaching the Rocky Mountains. You don't know how large they are. You have to get the Pacific where you can winter. Otherwise, you're going to die of starvation and die of cold in the mountains. You have to go the right direction. No one had told them about this tributary. So they don't know whether they need to go north or continue going essentially south. All but two of the men were convinced they needed to take the North Fork. The two who decided that they should take the South Fork were named Meriwether Lewis and William Clark. They decided that because the water was clear, it probably meant it had come from the mountains. The other men were convinced that the water that was muddy, the North Fork, was probably the right one because the Missouri looked that way. So they thought it must be the same river. But the reality is that coming out of the mountains, the water would be clear and quick. And that is the water that they needed. But to Lewis and Clark's credit, they didn't just make an executive decision and insist on everybody following them. They could have done that. They were the commanders, but they realized that it would be better to make a convincing argument. So they actually offered to travel both of them and do some reconnaissance to determine which one was the correct way. And eventually they determined that the South Fork was the correct way. Well, along the way, Lewis is looking forward to knows that there is a set of water that there is a waterfall that they're going to confront at the Missouri. Again, they didn't know much. All they really knew about what they were going into is that there would be Shoshone Indians ahead. That was part of the reason they took Sacagawea, because she actually had been a Shoshone Indian who had been abducted many years earlier. So they knew that she spoke Shoshone and she would be able to help them get horses they would need to travel through the mountains. So they knew the Shoshone were there. They knew the Missouri River traveled west and possibly connected with the Columbia through a short portage, and they knew that they were mountains. That was about all they knew. But one other piece they knew about the Missouri is from the Indians, they had learned that there was a waterfall there. And Lewis approached that waterfall and wrote one of his more poetic descriptions. He says that there is a beautiful rainbow produced, which adds not a little to the beauty of this majestically grand scenery. After writing this imperfect description, I again viewed the falls and was so much disgusted with the imperfect idea which it conveyed of the scene that I determined to draw my pen across it and begin again. He was blown away by these falls. Now, I love waterfalls, and when I made this trip, I was so looking forward to seeing what Lewis had described so poetically. Some of you may know what I did not. They have dammed up the Missouri River at that point, and so it is now just a little trickle. It was the most disappointing part of my entire journey, but I did get to see it. My disappointment did not match the disappointment that Lewis and Clark had. Lewis was very much satisfied with the beauty of these waterfalls. But what he didn't realize is that there wasn't just one waterfall, not just two waterfalls, not just three, not just four. There were five waterfalls that they couldn't possibly travel up in dugout canoes. So they had to portage around them for 18 miles. On the right, you see a life-size diorama that you can see at a museum there at Great Falls, Montana. It's probably the best museum you'll see along the way. And you really get a sense of what these men were trying to do. Obviously, they're going uphill because that's why the water's falling downhill. They're going uphill 18 miles, moving these incredibly heavy dugout canoes and all of their supplies while walking over prickly pear cactus. But that wasn't enough, apparently, according to Mother Nature. They were exhausted. So many, and Lewis was a better speller than Clark was, but not a great speller. So much fatigued, he said. You get a sense of their dialects here, Connie. You can appreciate this. You can get a sense of their dialects because of the way they spelled some of these words. The men were so much fatigued that many of them are asleep in an instant when they tumble down from exhaustion or simply by slipping when they're trying to move all this material. But that was not enough. In the afternoon, a dreadful hailstorm came on, which lasted half an hour. Some of the lumps of ice that fell weighed 3 ounces and measured 7 inches in circumference. You've heard of golf ball size hail. This is more like softball sized hail. But they survive. And then they come to the mountains. Lewis wrote on the 12th of August, 1805, I therefore did not despair of shortly finding a passage through the mountains and of tasting the waters of the great Columbia this evening. Okay, he's just getting into the mountains and he thinks that these are pretty modest mountains, apparently, if he thinks he's actually going to taste the waters of the Columbia River. Well, that same day, he writes, after refreshing ourselves, we proceeded on to the top of the dividing range, from which I discovered immense ranges of mountains still to the west of us, with their tops partially covered with snow. He's not going to taste the waters of the Columbia for weeks. Instead, they're going to have to travel through these mountains, snow-covered mountains, for 11 days. This was the most arduous part of the entire journey. Everything you've heard so far pales in comparison to what they're about to experience. Now, this is a part of the Rocky Mountains known as the Bitterroot Mountains, so I'll be referring to them as the Bitterroot Range. So from September 11th to March 22nd, they're traveling through the mountains and then down the Columbia before they'll actually stop for the winter. This is another one of the dioramas, so it gives you a sense of what they were traveling. At least Sacagawea got to ride a horse at this point. Again, still carrying her baby on her back. And this is a very treacherous area when they're going over the Bitterroots. As Ordway, one of the sergeants, wrote, some places so steep and rocky that some of our horses fell backwards and rolled 20 or 30 feet among the rocks, but did not kill them. The mountains continue as far as our eyes could extend. They extend much further than we expected. We proceeded on. Those 3 words are so famous from the Lewis and Clark expedition that is the name of the Lewis and Clark Journal, because that's what they wrote again and again. We proceeded on, which is all they could do. Well, it's hard enough riding these horses or using these horses to carry their supplies, tramping through extremely deep snow. But on top of everything else, they're going weak because they don't have enough food. Lewis himself wrote, I find myself growing weak for the want of food, and most of the men complain of a similar deficiency and have fallen off very much. But they make it. After 11 days traveling through, they managed to avoid starvation. They managed to avoid dying of cold. They managed to avoid falling to their deaths in these high mountains. But now they have to travel down the Columbia. The good news is that the Columbia is now traveling west, so they're going with the current and they can travel much more quickly. The bad news is that now they're going to encounter another waterfall, another set of rapids. I love what Stephen Ambrose, who's the most famous writer about Lewis and Clark. There have been a number of books and various things you can imagine about Lewis and Clark. Ambrose is the most famous book. It's called Undaunted Courage, from a phrase that we use to describe Meriwether Lewis. I love his description of what happens here. By the standards of today's canoeist, this was a Class 5 rapid, meaning it could not be run, even in a modern canoe, specially designed for whitewater. Lewis and Clark are not traveling in a modern canoe. They're traveling in these giant, heavy, awkward dugout canoes. The natives, expert canoeists themselves, did not believe Lewis and Clark could do it in their big, heavy dugouts. They gathered by the hundreds along the banks to watch the white men drown themselves and to be ready to help themselves to the abandoned equipment afterward. But to the astonishment of the Indians, the Americans made the run without incident. Some of you may have seen the Columbia. I've given a lecture about Lewis and Clark on the Columbia River. It looks much different today. It is a mighty river, but it is not nearly because it's been dammed also, it is not nearly as wild as it would have been back then. And unfortunately for us, at least unfortunately for historical purposes, you can no longer see these rapids. Then they have to build another fort because, again, they're not going to try to travel back through these mountains in the wintertime. So they build another fort. And fortunately for us, again, operated by the National Park Service, you can see Fort Clatsop, a replica of Fort Clatsop, out there near Astoria, Oregon. So on November 24th, all the travelers, including York, remember he's Clark's slave, and Sacagawea, who would have had no rights normally, they get a chance to vote on where to camp for the winter. On December 30th, they finished building Fort Clatsop. You can see the green around here, and most of you know the Pacific Northwest is famous for being a rainforest and the rich greenery that you can experience there. It is gorgeous, but the reason why they have all of that is that there is so much rain. In fact, in their Lewis and Clark journals, they recorded rain, 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 small showers of rain, and hail. I love the way they put this, as usual. They spent 106 days at Fort Clatsop, and it rained on 94 of them. I got a sense of this myself, by the way. When I made that first trip, I planned to camp more often than I did. I usually spent the night in the car because it rained every single day that I was traveling. Once I got past South Dakota, it rained every single day, and that's even in the Great Plains. William Clark, who was usually a rock, was starting to lose at this point. Even he was starting to feel the strain of all of that rain. Well, while they're out there, they're thinking that they might be able to catch a boat because there were ships that would come to that part of the Pacific Northwest from time to time, but they were not going to be so lucky. During those 106 days, they did not see a single ship. Again, just as at Fort Mandan, you can get a sense of what it would have looked like there with the bunk beds and with the table that they would have had and chairs and such. So let's think about how far they've come. They finally have made it. They've been traveling for about a year and a half, and they have endured all the arduous travel of going up the Missouri River with that keel boat against the current. Sacagawea has been carrying her baby the entire way. They have coped with bears, mosquitoes, fleas. They managed to make the right decision at decision point. They managed to have enough supplies, thanks to Sacagawea, that they were able to continue traveling. One little incident I did not mention, but it's one of my favorites, and there is, again, a diorama here to illustrate this. This was not well, it could have been a major incident. It wasn't as bad as, I suppose, an encounter with a bear or going the wrong way on the Missouri River. But at one point, Lewis and Clark often traveled separately. Lewis liked to get out and do reconnaissance and walk and study the geography as he went. And at one point, Lewis and some others were ahead of Clark, so they left a note and attached it to a tree or a branch. Little did they know that a beaver would come along and chew the branch down. So later on, Clark didn't see the note that Meriwether Lewis had left for him. But they survived. They proceeded on. They proceeded on through that 18-mile portage. They made it through the Bitterroot Mountains. They have done an unbelievable job of making this journey, crossing the American West of thousands of miles through all of these points of adversity and challenge and more. And now it was time to go back. They were going to have to travel the same distance all over again in order to get back home, which meant they would have to travel back through the Bitterroot Mountains. When they tried at first, they realized they had left too early. and the snow was still 12 to 15 feet deep. At some point, they turned around, got a guide, and then tried again. They also had some run-ins, and because there's so much to cover, I can't cover all their interactions with the tribes. For the most part, they were friendly, but they did run into some trouble with some of them, and some of them were trying to steal their supplies. And at this point, you can imagine, after everything that Lewis and Clark have been through, they're starting to get a little testy, especially Lewis. At one point, he wrote, "These are the greatest thieves and scoundrels we have met with. I hope that the friendly interposition of this chief may prevent our being compelled to use some violence with these people. Our men seem well disposed to kill a few of them. 3 of them actually stole his dog. Here's a tip for you. You can do a lot of things to Meriwether Lewis. Don't try to steal his dog." Lewis was starting to lose it. At some point, he said he detected one of the Indians trying to steal an iron socket of a canoe pole, and he gave him several severe blows and made the men kick him out of camp. "I now informed the Indians that I would shoot the first of them that attempted to steal an article from us, that we were not afraid to fight them, that I had it in my power at that moment to kill them all and set fire to their houses. But it was not my wish to treat them with severity, provided they will let my property alone." We don't always know what was going through Lewis and Clark's minds, but at this point, you do get a sense, because Lewis recorded this in his journal, that he was feeling the strain. In one of the most momentous occasions, they actually got into a fight with the Blackfeet Indians, and they were concerned that a Blackfeet war party would soon be on their heels, because in the incident in which the Blackfeet were trying to steal their horses, Lewis actually shot and killed one of them. Now he's afraid that a giant contingent of Blackfeet are going to chase them down and kill them. So they wind up riding as hard and fast as they could for 24 hours straight. They travel 120 miles, and miraculously, at that very moment, they meet up with Clark's group from the Beaverhead and Great Falls, rounded a bend in their canoes. Lewis's party jumped off their horses and into the dugouts and made their way down. It sounds like something out of a movie. Okay, they're almost home. My timing's going pretty well here. Got about 15 minutes left. They're almost home. On October 12th, Lewis writes his last journal entry. I'm not sure anybody knows why. Lewis was a mercurial character. Clark was solid as a rock. He was the one who didn't seem to be as rattled, but Lewis probably suffered from bipolar disorder based on some of the information we know about him. He stops writing his journal. Fortunately, there were other journal entries, so we know what happens at the rest of the journey. August 14th in 1806, they return to Fort Mandan, and Sacagawea and Charbonneau and Jean-Baptiste are going to stay there. Don't have time to go into all the story here, but later on, William Clark is actually going to take in Sacagawea's son, Jean-Baptiste, and raise and educate him in St. Louis. Along the way, Clark had grown kind of a soft spot for Jean-Baptiste. He called him Little Pomp. On September 20th, they spot a cow. Doesn't seem like something to write home about, so to speak, but if you see a cow, you know you're getting closer to the domesticated part of agriculture, and you're getting closer to the civilized part of the country. Finally, they arrive. This is what Clark wrote. At 11 a.m., we met a Captain McClellan, late a captain of artillery of the United States Army, ascending in a large boat. This gentleman, an acquaintance of mine, Captain Lewis, was somewhat astonished to see us return, and appeared rejoiced to meet us. The gentleman informed us that we had long since been given out by the people of the U.S. generally and almost forgotten. After everything they have gone through, the people of the United States, for the most part, have largely forgotten about them. With one exception. You might guess who that is. The President of the United States had yet hopes of us. Jefferson still hoped that they would return, and Jefferson was the one who was correct. They did make it back. Well, what did they leave us? They left us a really remarkable legacy. For one thing, they collected a lot of specimens. Lewis took pains to describe each of them, plants and animals, as carefully as possible. So they were collecting plants, drying them, pressing them, storing away to be brought back to Jefferson. The dead animals, and not all of them went back dead, by the way. They actually sent back on the keelboat a live prairie dog. They call them barking squirrels, by the way, which I think is a better name, but we know them as prairie dogs. And there is a children's book that is called A Prairie Dog for the President because they actually sent the prairie dog all the way back to Washington, D.C., where Jefferson could see it. But the dead ones were measured, skinned, weighed, dissected, their horns, hides, skeletons preserved. So they're doing all of this work while they're trying to stay alive. A few of them were actually even stuffed. And as I said, some were sent back, were captured and sent back alive. By the way, it's extremely hard to capture a prairie dog. They were running water into the, because of course they live in the tunnels. They were pouring water into the tunnels, trying to get them out, and they did actually manage to capture one of them. Altogether, they recorded for science some 178 plants and 122 animals that previously had not been described. Among them were flora and fauna that have come to symbolize the West. So the antelope, the coyote, the bighorn sheep, the Sitka spruce, the cutthroat trout, of course, the prairie dog, and the grizzly bear. All of these things were things that were recorded by Lewis and Clark as part of their scientific work that they were doing along the way. And as I've said, they kept voluminous journals. And they are really something to see and something to read. You read about the adventures they had, and then you see the pictures that Lewis and Clark were drawing. As Donald Jackson has written, they were the writingest, so to speak, explorers of their time. They wrote constantly and abundantly, afloat or ashore, legibly and illegibly, and always with an urgent sense of purpose. Here are a few other pictures of the journals. You can see their handwriting there and the pictures they were drawing to document the specimens and the various things they were seeing along the way, flora and fauna. And as I said, Clark was a master cartographer. He was drawing maps along the way. And listen to how incredibly impressive they were. Though not formally trained in cartography, he had a natural genius for it and turned out to be superb at map making. Each day, now remember everything they're enduring, each day he had taken compass readings at every bend of the river or twist of the trail and used dead reckoning to note the mileage from point to point. These daily courses and distances were transferred to different sheets of paper and then transferred again onto larger strips of maps that marked distinct sections of the journey. And he was remarkably accurate for working by dead reckoning. Well, because of what they did, there was, of course, all the settlement and commerce that we have to this day. A series of dams built to prevent flooding and to provide irrigation and hydroelectricity has turned much of the Missouri into more lake than river. I referred to this earlier when I mentioned the Great Falls. The same goes for the Columbia. Salelo Falls, the Long and Short Narrows, the Cascades are now entombed under reservoirs. So as I said, unfortunately, we cannot see those things anymore. We just have to rely on the records that were left to us from Lewis and Clark journals and such. Of course, St. Louis turns into a major metropolis. And eventually in 1869, we get the Transcontinental Railroad. We also, this is a picture I took out there. The West has changed a lot now. Now you can be out almost literally in the middle of nowhere. I think I took this in South Dakota. I can't remember. Maybe Esprit remembers. I think she was with me. So Tesla car chargers, and this was a few years ago before it became as widely known. Dayton Duncan and Ken Burns. So Ken Burns, of course, has made a documentary about everything related to America, including one about Lewis and Clark. And this comes from a book that they wrote about Lewis and Clark. And I think they put it very dramatically here. And being first then, the core of discovery was also the last. They saw the West as it was before the rest of the nation followed them across the continent and changed it forever. They also had devastating effects on the Native Americans. In 1837, of course, this is decades later, but all of this was made possible because of the Lewis and Clark expedition. Smallpox was brought upriver, and it decimated the Mandans and the Dotses. 9 out of 10 of them died from the disease, and further upriver, the Blackfeet suffered the same fate. Okay, in the interest of time, I'm going to go ahead and take us to our last slide here, our second to the last slide. So it was one of the great journeys, perhaps the greatest journey in American history. It was filled with challenges that would have probably beaten most of us. But also, it's an inspiring journey when we think about all that they achieved along the way, especially Sacagawea. Through all of these challenges, all of the adversity, they proceeded on.